Sunlight dances across the 50-story glass facade of the Enron building in Houston, Texas. To the outside world, this isn't just an office, it's a cathedral of the new economy. The crooked E logo sits prominently, tilted at a jaunty angle that suggests a company always leaning into the future, always one step ahead of the slow, old-fashioned world of energy. Inside, the air feels charged with the static of billion-dollar ideas. It is the year 2000, and Enron has just been named the most innovative company in America. For the employees, the world feels absolutely limitless. Take a mid-level analyst like David, a loyal worker in the broadband division. He joined the company lured by the promise of changing how the world communicates. Every morning, he adjusts his tie and feels a surge of pride. His parents have their life savings invested in Enron stock, a decision he encouraged with absolute confidence. The stock price is a rocket ship, climbing toward $90 a share. David believes he is part of a meritocracy where the smartest people win. He spends 12 hours a day staring at spreadsheets, fueled by the belief that he is building a legacy. At the heart of this mythos is Kenneth Lay. He is more than a chairman. He is the benevolent architect of this empire. A preacher's son with a warm smile, Lay is a man who can walk into a room and make everyone feel important. He speaks of corporate responsibility with such conviction that it feels impossible to doubt his integrity. Under his leadership, Enron has transformed into a global titan. To the employees, Ken Lay is the North Star and the symbol of corporate perfection and American success. But beneath the warmth of Lay's image lies a jagged reality orchestrated by Jeffrey Skilling. The culture at Enron isn't just competitive, it's predatory. Every year, the rank and yank system identifies the bottom performers and removes them without hesitation. It is a world of performance review committees where sharp-elbowed ambition is the only currency. This high-pressure environment creates a frantic need to perform, to innovate, and above all, to never admit failure. In this pressure cooker, the employees aren't just working for a paycheck. They are fighting for survival in a game where only the smartest thrive. This drive for perfection creates a strange paradox. While the stock price soars, the actual financial reports are becoming increasingly impenetrable. They are thick, dense volumes filled with complex mathematical formulas that even seasoned Wall Street analysts struggle to explain. On the trading floor, the energy is electric, yet the actual source of the profit is becoming a blurry, shifting target. Deals are signed based on projected future profits, recorded today as if the cash were already in the bank. It is a house of cards built with high-gloss paper, where the appearance of success has become everything. In a quiet corner of the executive floor, Andrew Fastow, the ambitious CFO, sits alone late at night. He looks at internal ledgers that don't match the glossy brochures handed out to investors. He sees a widening gap, a black hole, where real debt is being swallowed by complex entities with names like Raptors. For the first time, the numbers aren't making sense, even to the man who designed them. He realizes that the public celebration in the streets of Houston is based on a lie that is growing larger and more expensive to maintain every single day, a dark reality. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The tension finally breaks in the heavy silence of an elevator. David is riding down to the lobby after a long shift when he is joined by a senior risk manager whose eyes look hollow with exhaustion. They stand in silence as the floor numbers click down. Just as the doors begin to slide open at the lobby, the older man leans in, his voice a barely audible whisper that chills David to the bone. "Get your parents out, David," he says, staring straight ahead at the polished glass. "The Golden Boy is built on sand, and the tide is coming in." David stood alone in the shadow of the shimmering tower. The warning David received echoed through the halls of the broadband division, but while the ground floor trembled with uncertainty, the executive suite vibrated with a different, more arrogant energy. This was the domain of Jeffrey Skilling, a man whose intellectual arrogance was matched only by his disdain for traditional industry. Skilling wasn't interested in pipes or power plants. He was interested in the trade. He viewed Enron as a laboratory for financial innovation, a place where the smartest guys in the room could bend economic laws to their will. Alongside him stood Andrew Fastow, the ambitious CFO who approached accounting as a medium for creative expression rather than a record of history. Together, they were the master architects of a house of glass, convincing the world they had discovered a new way to manufacture wealth out of thin air. The cornerstone of this illusion was a concept called mark-to-market accounting. In the old world of energy, a company recorded profit only when cash actually hit the register. Under Skilling's aggressive vision, Enron convinced regulators to let them book the entire projected value of a 20-year contract the very day the ink dried on the paper. If a deal looked like it might make $100 million over 2 decades, Enron claimed that entire amount as immediate profit on their current quarterly report. It was pure financial alchemy. It allowed them to report record-shattering earnings while their actual cash reserves were quietly dwindling. The pressure to keep the stock price climbing meant every quarter required a more spectacular innovation to mask the growing void between reported success and reality. However, even the most creative accounting couldn't hide the mounting debt required to fuel their frantic global expansion. This was where Andrew Fastow's genius truly took center stage. He created a labyrinthine network of special-purpose entities, most notably the Raptors. To the outside observer, these looked like independent companies, but in reality, they were sophisticated shells designed for one purpose: to swallow Enron's losses and hide its debts from the eyes of investors. By shuffling failing assets into these entities, Fastow kept the main balance sheet looking pristine and debt-free. It was a shell game played with billions of dollars, a moral slippage that began with stretching the rules and ended with a complete redefinition of the truth. Within the executive suites, the line between aggressive business and outright fraud simply vanished. This ruthlessness wasn't confined to the ledgers. It bled into the real world with devastating consequences during the California energy crisis. On the Enron trading floor, the atmosphere was predatory and electric. Traders, encouraged by the culture Skilling had built, realized they could manufacture artificial shortages by shutting down power plants under the guise of routine maintenance. As the lights went out across the Golden State, the price of electricity skyrocketed, and Enron's profits surged. They were profiting from darkness and from the fear of families whose refrigerators were failing. Internal tapes would later reveal traders laughing about Grandma Millie paying through the nose for power. For the smartest guys, human suffering was simply a variable in a profitable equation, a necessary byproduct of their perceived market dominance. Yet, not everyone at the shimmering tower was blind to the impending storm. A growing internal friction began to heat up between the aggressive deal-makers and the risk managers who were tasked with monitoring the company's exposure. These managers saw the Raptors for what they were, a ticking time bomb of toxic debt. They saw the mark-to-market profits as imaginary numbers that could never be realized in the real world. But in the Darwinian world of rank and yank, to speak out was to invite professional suicide. Those who questioned the logic of the entities were sidelined, their concerns dismissed as the ramblings of people who simply weren't smart enough to understand the new economy. This systemic suppression of dissent ensured that the warning signs remained ignored. The friction reached a breaking point when the complexity of the fraud finally outstripped the ability to manage it. Andrew Fastow began to realize that the Raptors were no longer sustainable. They were tied to the value of Enron's own stock, creating a circular logic that required the price to rise forever. The moment the market softened, the entire structure would begin to cannibalize itself. A black hole had opened in the heart of the company's accounts, a multi-billion-dollar void that no amount of creative accounting or energy manipulation could fill. The architects of deception stood on the edge of the abyss, realizing that the brilliant facade they had built was finally starting to crack under the weight of its own impossible lies. As the internal rot deepened, it was no longer just the risk managers whispering in the shadows. Sharon Watkins, a vice president of corporate development, began to peel back the layers of the complex financial onion Andrew Fastow had grown. She possessed a keen eye for the movement of capital, and what she saw was a terrifying landscape of ghosts. The Raptors were not independent partners. They were parasitic entities tied directly to Enron's own stock. If the price dipped, these structures would vanish, leaving behind a crater that could destroy everything they had built. The weight of this discovery felt like a physical burden on her chest, a secret so volatile it threatened to incinerate her career. To speak up was to challenge the smartest guys in the room, risking being labeled a traitor in Houston's corporate elite. Yet the alternative was to remain a silent accomplice to a catastrophe that would eviscerate the lives of thousands. Finally, she sat at her computer and began to type a memo to Ken Lay. Her words were blunt and prophetic. She warned him that Enron was about to implode in a wave of accounting scandals. It was a desperate plea for the chairman to see the fire burning in the basement before it reached the penthouse and consumed them all. However, the culture within the glass walls was designed to stifle such clarity. The rank and yank system had created a Darwinian nightmare where survival depended on unwavering loyalty to the company line. Those who asked difficult questions were dismissed as weak or un-Enron. This pervasive silence acted as a protective shell for the fraud, ensuring that while many suspected the foundation was rotting, almost no one dared to point at the cracks. Sharon's memo arrived at a desk surrounded by sycophants interested only in the next bonus cycle. The warning was received as a problem to be contained rather than a crisis to be solved. On August 14, 2001, the first massive tremor shook the building. Jeffrey Skilling, the primary architect of Enron's modern identity, abruptly announced his resignation. He had been CEO for only 6 months, and his departure sent shockwaves through the markets. The public reason was personal, but for those inside the tower, it felt like a captain jumping from a sinking ship before the passengers even knew there was a leak. The media, once enamored with Skilling's bravado, began to circle with sharpened pens. The invincibility of the Golden Boy was dead, replaced by an underlying frantic panic that no PR strategy could truly suppress. Ken Lay stepped back into the role of CEO, projecting a calm, grandfatherly demeanor to soothe the growing hysteria. In televised internal meetings, he stood before employees who had tied their entire futures to the company's success and assured them that Enron was fundamentally sound. He described the stock as an incredible bargain, encouraging them to double down even as the price began a steady, agonizing descent. But behind the scenes, a darker reality was unfolding. While Lay was publicly championing the company's future, he was quietly offloading his own shares to pay off personal debts. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a leader leading his troops into a canyon while he prepared his own secret parachute. Outside the tower, the financial noose was tightening. Credit rating agencies and banks, sensing blood in the water, began to demand transparency. They wanted to know the true nature of the debt hidden within the Raptors and the SPEs. The circular logic of Fastow's design was finally failing. As the stock price dropped, the collateral held by the entities lost its value, triggering massive debt repayments. The illusion of infinite liquidity was evaporating, replaced by the cold, hard math of insolvency and the looming threat of ruin for everyone involved. In a final, private meeting in the executive wing, the air grew stagnant as the sun set over the city. Ken Lay sat across from his advisors, silence in the room, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, the smartest guys were out of answers. The report was blunt. The Raptors were failing, the debt was coming due, and the black hole was now wide enough to swallow the tower. The tide was at the door. The ticker tape in the lobby of the Enron building, once a source of immense pride, now resembled a digital countdown toward total oblivion. The stock, which had hovered near $90 just a year prior, was now shedding value with every frantic breath of the traders on the floor. On October 16th, the hammer finally fell. Enron reported its first quarterly loss in years, a staggering $618 million. But the real poison was buried in the fine print. A $1.2 billion reduction in shareholder equity linked to the partnerships Sharon Watkins had warned about. The black hole was no longer a risk. It was a visible, hungry maw on the balance sheet. As news of the SEC investigation broke, the atmosphere inside the glass tower shifted from denial to a cold, predatory panic. In the executive suites, the search for a savior began. The White Knight appeared as Dynegy, a smaller crosstown rival. For a brief moment in early November, it seemed a merger would salvage the wreckage. Ken Lay, ever the salesman, touted the deal as a masterstroke of resilience. But the accountants at Dynegy were cold-eyed scavengers. As they peered into Enron's ledgers, they found a labyrinth of hidden debt so deep that no amount of capital could fill it. When Dynegy walked away on November 28th, the final pillar of the Enron myth collapsed. Meanwhile, at the offices of Arthur Andersen, the sound of the future was the relentless rhythmic grind of industrial shredders. Lead partner David Duncan and his team realized that the SEC was preparing to dismantle the entire firm. In a desperate attempt to erase the paper trail of their complicity, tons of internal documents were fed into the machines. The shredders ran late into the humid Houston nights, the smell of scorched paper and ozone filling the hallways, as a decade of financial fiction was reduced to gray confetti. It was a frantic, futile dance of destruction, an attempt to unwrite the history of the Raptors before the federal agents could arrive with their subpoenas. While the elite burned evidence, the common workers were led to the slaughter. The company instituted a blackout period on retirement accounts, ostensibly for a change in plan providers. This freeze meant that the thousands of loyal employees who had invested their life savings in Enron stock were now helpless spectators to their own ruin. They watched the screens as their net worth evaporated by the minute, unable to sell a single share. A mid-level manager, who once looked at his retirement fund as $1 million promise, now watched it dwindle to the price of a used car, then a week's groceries, and finally, nothing. They were locked in the belly of a sinking ship, while the captains were already in the lifeboats. The end came on December 2nd, 2001, when Enron officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate failure in American history, a collapse of such magnitude that it destroyed the reputation of Houston as an energy titan. The glass tower was no longer a temple of the future. It was a sprawling crime scene. The grand illusion vanished, revealing that the innovation Jeffrey Skilling and Andrew Fastow had championed was never about creating a more efficient world. It was a sophisticated, high-stakes shell game where the only real product was the perception of profit, and the only winners were those who had known exactly when to exit. The realization began to sink in as employees were handed cardboard boxes and told to clear their desks. The culture of perfection had been a mask for a culture of predation. The smartest guys in the room had simply been the most effective at lying to themselves and the world. As federal investigators finally swarmed the building, their flashlights illuminating the dark corners where the Raptors once hid, the scale of the devastation became clear. It wasn't just a company that had died. It was trust of a generation of investors and security of thousands of families who had believed in the golden dream of Houston's favorite son. The once celebrated executive floors were now silent, stripped of prestige, as ghosts haunted empty corridors, leaving behind the bitter taste of betrayal. The silence in the lobby of the Enron headquarters was heavier than the noise of the panic had ever been. Thousands of employees walked out of the glass doors for the last time, their lives packed into cardboard boxes that felt far too light for the decades of service they contained. For many, these boxes held the remains of a 30-year career that had been vaporized in less than 30 days. There was the story of a maintenance worker who had planned to retire to a small ranch, only to find that his retirement fund, once valued at $500,000, was now worth less than $1,200. The shimmering tower, once a hive of ambition, became a ghost town of empty cubicles, abandoned chairs, and family photos. Computer monitors remained frozen on static screens, and the high-end espresso machines in the executive lounges sat cold. The hallways that once vibrated with the arrogance of the smartest guys in the room were now haunted by the quiet, hollow echoes of those who had lost everything. Beyond the walls of the Houston headquarters, the ripples of the collapse turned into a tidal wave that crashed against the shores of the nation. It wasn't just the Enron employees who suffered. It was the retirees in Florida, the teachers in California, and the firefighters in Ohio. Pension funds that had viewed Enron as a safe, blue-chip bet found their portfolios gutted. The betrayal was systemic, reaching into the savings of millions of people who had never even stepped foot in Texas. They had trusted the analysts, the banks, and the glowing financial reports, only to realize they were victims of a sophisticated heist. The logo was no longer a sign of progress. It became a brand of infamy, a symbol of a corporate culture that viewed the public as a resource to be harvested rather than a community to be served. In the midst of this growing darkness, the human cost took its most tragic form. Cliff Baxter, a former Enron executive who had once been a vital part of the inner circle, found himself unable to reconcile the reality of the fraud with his own internal moral compass. Baxter had been one of the few who had voiced internal concerns about the predatory nature of the accounting practices, but his resignation hadn't granted him peace. The mounting pressure of the impending investigations and the suffocating weight of the collective shame became an unbearable burden. He was found in his car, a victim of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His death was a grim reminder that while some were still counting their offshore millions, others were paying for the deception with their lives. The tragedy sent a profound shockwave through the legal and corporate community, signaling that the Enron story was no longer just about financial spreadsheets, but about the limits of the human psyche. The media circus that followed was relentless and unforgiving. The same publications that had put Jeffrey Skilling and Ken Lay on their covers as visionaries now depicted them as the faces of corporate evil. News vans crowded the streets outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed like spears toward the sky. Federal investigators from the FBI and the Department of Justice were building a conspiracy of circles, a complex legal framework designed to pierce the veil of deniability. The executives claimed they were merely following orders, or that the accounting was far too complex for any individual to fully grasp. They played a desperate game of musical chairs with responsibility, each pointing a finger at the person sitting next to them. But the prosecutors were meticulous, tracing the paper trails and the messages that proved the leadership knew exactly how brittle the glass house really was. The visual contrast during this period was a searing indictment of the era. On one side of the city, Ken Lay and Jeffrey Skilling were seen being led away in handcuffs by federal agents. On the other side, a former executive secretary who had lost her entire pension was seen starting a night shift at a local grocery store, her third job of the day. The images were a stark representation of the fallout. One group faced a trial that would be funded by the remnants of their vast wealth, while the other faced a lifetime of survival. The arrogance of the trading floor had been replaced by the cold reality of the breadline, and the legacy of the company was now written in the tears of the families who had believed in the golden lie of the tower. The scene shifted from the streets of Houston to the sterile wood-paneled confines of the federal courtroom, where the smartest guys in the room finally faced a jury of the very people they had once looked down upon. It was the trial of the century, a legal showdown that promised to pull back the curtain on the most complex fraud in American history. The air inside the courtroom was thick with expectant tension. For months, the public watched as titans of industry were reduced to defendants, their bespoke suits no longer symbols of authority, but of a fallen empire. Ken Lay took the stand with a strategy rooted in calculated ignorance. He presented himself not as a mastermind, but as a grandfatherly figure who had been betrayed by subordinates. His defense was simple. He was the visionary who focused on the big picture, while technical details were handled by others. He claimed no knowledge of the specific accounting tricks or the raptors that had hollowed out the company's core. To the jury, he spoke of his faith and love for Enron, attempting to paint a leader who was just as much a victim as the employees in the breadlines. But the prosecutors were relentless, presenting evidence that he was intimately aware of the impending doom, even as he encouraged his staff to buy more stock. Jeffrey Skilling was defiant to the point of arrogance. He did not hide behind a mask of ignorance. Instead, he doubled down on the brilliance of his creations. Skilling remained combative, treating the prosecutor's questions with the thinly veiled contempt that had defined his tenure as CEO. He argued that the market simply did not understand Enron's genius and that the collapse was a result of a run on the bank caused by hysteria rather than systemic fraud. His presence was a stark reminder of the culture he had built, one where being the smartest person in the room was a shield against morality. He refused to admit that mark-to-market accounting had been a tool for deception, insisting until the very end that his methods were the future of global commerce. The most devastating blow came from Andrew Fastow, the former CFO who had once been their closest collaborator. Having reached a plea deal with the government, Fastow sat in the witness box and systematically dismantled the defense. With clinical precision, he explained how he created the complex entities to hide billions in debt and inflate profits. He admitted to his own greed, but his testimony pinned the ultimate responsibility on the culture of earnings management fostered by Lay and Skilling. It was a betrayal within the inner circle that the defense could not overcome. The image of the unified leadership was shattered, replaced by the reality of men turning on each other to save themselves from a lifetime behind bars. When the verdicts were finally read, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. For the thousands of families watching from the halls, the word guilty brought a surge of vindication, yet it was a victory that felt strangely hollow. No amount of legal justice could replenish a vanished pension or return the years of stolen security. As Lay and Skilling were led out, the weight of the moment was heavy. They had been convicted by a jury of regular citizens, the common people, whose lives they had treated as collateral damage in their pursuit of a soaring stock price. The story took an unexpected turn months later, before Ken Lay could be sentenced to the decades in prison that awaited him. While vacationing in Aspen, the man who had built Enron suffered a massive heart attack. His sudden death felt like the ultimate escape, a final act of evasion from the earthly consequences of his actions. Because he died before his appeals were exhausted, his conviction was legally vacated, leaving his estate intact and denying his victims the finality of a settled judgment. It was a twist that many saw as a final, bitter injustice in a saga already defined by unfairness. Jeffrey Skilling did not share that fate. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison, a term reflecting the total magnitude of the massive crime he had committed. As the echoes of the courtroom grew silent, the physical world began to erase the evidence of the empire. Workers in hard hats were seen scaling the shimmering glass tower in downtown Houston, their movements slow and deliberate against the backdrop of the Texas sky. With heavy tools and unsentimental efficiency, they unbolted the massive, crooked E logo that had once stood as a beacon of the future. To those watching from the sidewalks below, it was not just a piece of corporate branding coming down. It was the final, public extraction of a tumor. The logo, which had once cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to design and install, was lowered by a crane and hauled away on a flatbed truck like scrap metal. The building, now officially stripped of its identity, became a hollow shell, a monument to a grand dream that had curdled into a nightmare for thousands of families. In the surrounding offices, the high-back leather chairs and mahogany desks were auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The physical remnants of an empire sold to satisfy the smallest fraction of the debt it had incurred. The shockwaves of Enron's collapse reached far beyond the city limits of Houston, forcing a reckoning that the financial world had avoided for decades. Legislators in Washington, desperate to restore public trust in a broken system, scrambled to pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It was a piece of legislation born from the ashes of shredded documents and empty pension funds, designed to hold CEOs personally accountable for the honesty of their books. For a time, it felt like a new era of transparency had dawned. Boards of directors became more cautious, and auditing firms like the now-defunct Arthur Andersen were replaced by stricter, more regulated entities. The era of the smartest guys in the room seemed to have been replaced by an era of the watchful eyes in the room, where complexity was no longer accepted as a substitute for clarity. However, the ghost of Enron was not so easily exorcised. While the laws changed, the underlying machinery of human incentive remained dangerously intact. The culture of the quick win, driven by massive quarterly bonuses and the relentless pressure of stock options, continued to simmer beneath the surface of the global economy. Less than a decade later, the same patterns of rationalization and excessive risk-taking would resurface in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. The names were different, and the financial instruments were even more complex, but the fundamental error was identical: the belief that reality could be bent to fit the desires of a spreadsheet. It was a sobering reminder that corruption is not a flaw in the system, but a potential within the people who run it, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. This erosion of ethics rarely happens in a single dramatic moment of villainy. It is a slow, quiet descent. It begins with a minor adjustment to a report, a small lie told to protect a bigger truth, or a creative interpretation of a rule that everyone else seems to be following. For the executives at Enron, the tragedy was that many of them likely believed they were doing the right thing for the company until the very moment the handcuffs were clicked shut. They were good people who had convinced themselves that the rules were for those who lacked their vision. They had mastered the art of rationalization, turning greed into a virtue and deception into a strategy, proving that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Today, the tower still stands in Houston, now occupied by different companies with different logos, but for the former employees, it remains a haunted house. A former mid-level staffer, who once walked those halls with a sense of purpose, might stand on the opposite corner and look up at the glass today. He does not see the sleek architecture or the modern business hub. He sees the faces of colleagues who lost their homes, the stress that aged his friends by a decade in a single year, and the vanished security of a lifetime of hard work. To him, the numbers on the screen were never just digits or abstract data points. They were the tangible building blocks of a human life. They were a daughter's college tuition that had to be cancelled, the medical bills for elderly parents that could no longer be paid, and the quiet, simple dignity of a well-earned retirement that was stolen in a single afternoon of corporate panic. The Crooked E may have been hauled off to a junkyard, but the spirit of Enron remains a persistent warning. It serves as a reminder that when a culture prioritizes perception over reality, reality eventually demands its due with interest. The world moved on, the markets recovered, and new giants rose to take Enron's place. Yet, the question remains whether the lessons were truly learned, or if the world is simply waiting for the next group of smartest guys to find a new way to hide the truth. The legacy of Enron is not found in the law books or the ruins of the company, but in the unsettling realization that the line between innovation and fraud is often thinner than we dare to admit. The crookedness was never just in the logo. It was in the heartbeat of the ambition itself. As the sun sets over Houston, the glass of the old headquarters reflects a world that looks much the same, leaving us to wonder if the name has changed, but the game remains exactly the same.